this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a review of the Gigabyte RTX 4070 Ti. In this video, I may well end up touching your soul, and if I do, subscribe. But here I'm going to be talking to you about the highlights, features, and my experience of this Gigabyte card, what it's like to use, the benchmarks and the setup process for it. I'm also going to show you it installed in the standard position and with vertical mounting and with RGB cables, as you saw earlier on, and more. I'm going to talk about my experiences with it software-wise and in terms of video editing and gaming and all those other things. And I want to talk about some of the things that I found along the way with it and some things to bear in mind that are pretty important if you're going to be using this card. Now, this is quite a large thing, as you'll see, and it does come with some nice highlights straight out of the box. But in the usual 40 series fashion, it comes with an adapter, putting two 8-pin PCIe connectors into a single new connector from NVIDIA. And this makes things not look that neat. I'll show you the setup process for that in a minute, because I think it's worth bearing in mind. The other thing is you also have a anti-sag bracket, which is probably a good thing, because as you've seen, it's a bit chunky, quite large, and may well cause some problems over time. I'm going to show you in two different cases, by the way, this GPU later on, so you get to see sort of size and how it fits in two Lian Li cases. So more on that a bit later as well. And then I want to get into the installation process of the cables and the setup there, because I think that's worth knowing and seeing. You'll see that it has some nice air venting and obviously a lot of fins for those thermal heat pipes, so good dissipation of heat. And I actually have done some tests on this that I'll include in the review of the case, but also later on showing you the benchmark tests on this and the performance of it. But one of the things I found interesting is it also has 0 RPM mode. So despite the fact that it's got these 3 fans on it, those fans won't spin, and sometimes they don't even spin when it's under load, so it's actually pretty good at keeping cool. And I haven't had any issues with it being loud either, and no problems there with excessive noise during my testing, which is pretty nice. You'll see it as actually quite a nice looking card as well. I do really like it. When I got it out of the box, I thought it was nice looking. However, I will say I don't like the RGB, but we'll talk about that a bit later on and the problems that I had with that are worth knowing about if you've purchased or are using the card. Now you'll see, obviously this is quite a large thing where it does have a number of ports on it, so you do have the ability to connect up multiple different things. I've been using this with my 49-inch Samsung Odyssey G9 monitor and also with a 4K 27-inch, so I've got a bit of experience with both double DisplayPort connections and HDMI connectivity, testing out in various different ways, and I'll show you some of that testing later on and what that was like. And you'll see one of the other things is it has a BIOS overclock and silent mode. There's an actual little switch on there that I'll give you a close-up view of in a second that allows you to flip between those two modes. Obviously that silent one has that benefit of running really quiet, but as standard it still delivers really good performance. And I thought it was worth obviously talking about size, because as you might be aware, the 40 series cards are pretty big, and this is obviously not the highest end of the 40 series, and yet it's still pretty large. So here's a stressed banana for a size comparison, just to get an idea there. But as I said, I'll also show it mounted in a case a bit later on, so you can see what it's like in a couple of different cases if you're deciding to build and trying to work out whether this card will fit in the case you've chosen, or get an idea of that. Obviously, I'll leave all the information on the specs in terms of the actual size of the card in the description, so you can find that out on paper what it's like. But to give you real world examples, I thought that would be useful. And obviously, triple fan setup and double bracket setup as well for the rear of the case. And a close-up look at some of the fins. Now, interesting point here is that the power adapter there is actually quite close to those fins, which if you saw my strimmer video on the Lian Li new strimmer cables, actually those fins are actually quite easy to bend if you're not careful as well. So just watch out for that if you've got a chunky power adapter and you're not using the standard one that comes pre-included. But obviously the benefit here is that it does only have one power connection, so that makes life a lot easier in terms of keeping things looking neat. Close-up look at that switch as well. You can see there's a little switch in there. Basically, you need to just flip it over with your finger. Now, a bit more on the power adapter and the setup of this, because I think it's worth knowing. There are different options when it comes to the setup of these, depending on the power supply unit you're using. So this adapter comes as standard, which is plugs in here. You need to make sure you push it in all the way and that it's clipped in nice and solidly. And that is then the standard setup. You would then use two 8-pin PCIe connectors connected from your power supply unit. So I'm going to show you the setup process for that. Now, ideally, you'd want to use two separate cables if possible. This is a daisy chain cable with an NZXT power supply. These are pretty standard. You do see this sort of pigtail effect here. And that setup will still work, but you might not get the best performance. So it's probably better to use two single cables if you can manage it. But the standard installation obviously is it plugs into the PCIe connector on your power supply unit, and then the other end plugs into those adapters. That will then ensure that you've got enough power running through. But the problem with this obviously is you've got two cables coming out of the graphics card, and it doesn't look particularly tidy, does it? And you end up with pinching these two 8-pins together and putting them into the adapter to give it enough juice, and it just ends up looking quite messy, and that is the problem with these 40 series. However, there are solutions out there. If you're purchasing a new build, doing a new build, then you can potentially buy yourself a new power supply unit. It's also worth bearing in mind just how much power that the 40 series cards can draw, because they can draw quite a lot of power, especially the top end. And I'll leave the information on that in the specs so you can find out more about the draw of this, but it's also worth checking a power supply calculator to make sure the system's able to handle it, because they're known for taking quite a bit of juice. So you need to bear in mind that and think about whether you've actually got a PSU that's up to the task, because there's quite a lot of wattage going through there. So another alternative is the ATX 3.0 power supply units, which have a adapter. So it's basically this cable is now the same on both ends. So it's that same 600 watt cable, and it has that same adapter at both ends of there, and that makes things a lot neater. So this is, again, that NZXT C1200 power supply unit, and it has the same connections on both ends. Just plug them one into the other. The other alternative is something like this, the Lian Li streamers. So they've just released these 40 series variants of the RGB cables, and these will work with this graphics card as well. And this is basically an extension cable. So even if you're using that two adapter one, so the one with two 8-pin PCIe connections on it, you can run that to the back of the case and hide that away and make it look a lot neater. So that's an option there. Obviously, I'm using the 600 watt variant, but there are different variants of this adapter, and I have done a video separately on it if you want to find out more about it. But then the end result is this. Now, so as I said earlier on, I use this GPU in two different cases and in two different mounting setups. You can see it mounted here vertically in the Lian Li Lancool 216. And I wanted to talk about the performance of that and what it was like. But you will see that out of the box, as standard, when the PC's on, those fans don't spin. And that is definitely a benefit. You can see the case fans are spinning, but the performance is still really good, and I'll show you a bit more on that in a minute. And then this is the Lian Li Dynamic Evo, so there's a different case, the standard installation, so you get an idea of sort of size and how much space you've got in those cases. You can see there's still a fair amount of room at the end, so it's not so huge it's going to be touching the far end of the case, for example. Obviously, this is just two examples, but you can get an idea of what it looks like. Also, in that standard installation, they are not ideal with a streamer setup, but I talked about that in the previous video and what that's like and how it's probably better to do it the other way that I did with the vertical mounting. But you'll see again, fans aren't spinning there, and it does actually look all right from this angle. Now, interestingly, you've got RGB lighting on the Gigabyte logo and also around the fan rim. What I found, and it's really worth bearing this in mind, and I'll get to this in a minute, is that the RGB, as you can see here, is lit up when I'm playing in this setup back in the Lancool case, and you'll see you've got lighting around the fan rims. What I found is, as standard, it does flash occasionally, so you do need to make sure you download the RGB Fusion software in order to make sure that that's running nicely. But now when I talk about performance, so this is a 4K LG monitor, and I played a number of different games on it. So this is Ghost Runner, which is a pretty fast-paced game. I whacked it up to 4K, and obviously the visuals are up there pretty nicely. And yet the results of that experience was getting 130 FPS, which is decent. Now this does have DLSS options, as do a number of other games. But I also have been playing a variety of games on my own machine, so I've actually had some mix between it. And the experience has been really good and smooth. I've managed to both game and record clips from my other channel with this quite easily, playing a variety of games, including Ready or Not, Sea of Thieves, and other things. And you can see that the temps have actually been pretty decent as well. So it's getting around 50 degrees, 60 degrees C on 4K maxed graphics and visuals. This is on the Outer Worlds, so another pretty good looking game. And you'll see the temps there again, about 50 degrees off that GPU, and about the same from the CPU as well. But I was also recording footage at the point, so it's worth mentioning. You've seen already, but I was using OBS to record while also playing, and I have done some benchmark tests of it as well. And nice smooth FPS in the high 80s, 90s, and over 100. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on the game you're playing, but my experience has been really, really good. I come from a 3090 as my main card. I was expecting that maybe the 4070 wouldn't perform quite as well as 3090 did, but it does deliver the goods in a number of different ways. You get access to NVIDIA's DLSS3, the deep learning super sampling, the latest version of that, and more ray tracing capabilities as well. So it's worth bearing that in mind. You'll have access to the latest tech if you're using this. And I also managed to record, stream, and get decent FPS out of it as well. So here's some other clips. You can see now I'm playing Ready or Not, which is an FPS shooter co-op game. It's really good fun. And again, similar sort of high FPS, 80-ish around there. And it's pretty frantic and intense. And again, I've put the graphics up to maximum on this. And that's the thing I found, is actually the 4070 seems to be pretty capable of running games at 4K with relative ease. And usually 4K can be pretty punishing, and yet I'm still getting pretty decent FPS on here. Now, these aren't the most punishing games. Obviously, if you're trying to run Cyberpunk, for example, with that latest ray tracing release with this 4070, it's probably going to struggle, but it still looks pretty mint. And in usual games, you're still getting on really well. And yes, it will run Fortnite, which I've been setting up for my kids to play. So you will run those sorts of 1080p games quite comfortably without any problems. Now, the Gigabyte Control Center gives you access to a variety of things, including scanning it for overclocking purposes. You also have the ability to adjust the fan curve and things like here. Now, it does have RGB fusion in it as well, but there is actually a separate download for the RGB side of things, and it's really important to get that, and I'll link to those in the description, because what I found is, as standard, the RGB around the fans just flashes, which is really annoying, and that is the main gripe that I have with this GPU, is just that the RGB display is not very nice, and it can be quite distracting, just depending on how you've got it set up, because you can actually see the RGB lighting through the top of the GPU, even when it's not vertically mounted. So if you're looking down on it, then that's an issue potentially, because it's quite a distraction out of the corner of your eye, at least in my opinion. But overall, I was impressed with the performance of this thing. It's a nice looking card. It's not so massive that it's going to cause case problems. The performance is pretty good at 4K. It temps are nice, and also it just runs really quiet, especially with that 0 RPM mode. Naturally, aside from playing and gaming, I've also been using this card for video editing, swapping out from my 3090. So I wanted to do some tests to see what the performance is like there. Rendering's obviously been really smooth, but what I found was interesting is actually the 4070 Ti has actually shaved a couple of minutes off my rendering time. So the one rendering that you can see now is actually with the 3090, because I've swapped back my main machine to that. And I've only managed to shave a couple of minutes off the time it takes to complete the video, which is pretty interesting. So 4070 Ti is actually better than 3090 in Davinci Resolve. So you're hitting a few different things there that are hopefully useful. Don't forget to check out the description to find out more, and if you're interested to see the full video on that case. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.